Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into a movement that kicked off over 2,000 years ago, led by a teacher walking the incredibly dusty, rugged roads of ancient Galilee. Now, to put that into perspective for a second, while Rome was out there building these massive, magnificent marble monuments and expansive aqueducts, Galilee was pretty much a remote backwater. Most people there were just living in cramped mud brick houses, barely scraping by. But here's why it's such a fascinating historical and cultural study. The words spoken in that specific, remote region, words centered entirely on love, forgiveness, humility, and faith, were completely revolutionary. We're going to look really closely at how this radical message of compassion contrasted so sharply with the undeniably harsh realities of the ancient world.
To really get a grip on this movement, I want you to step back in time with me. Imagine walking those dusty roads. Picture the incredibly busy, tension-filled markets of ancient Jerusalem and Galilee. The central question we really have to ask ourselves today is this: can a message of absolute peace and profound compassion actually survive, let alone thrive, in a world that's literally defined by daily conflict, military occupation, and severe hardship?
Okay, Section 1, Galilee's Harsh Realities, a world of struggle.
Before we even get into the specific teachings of this era, we absolutely have to understand the intense social challenges of the time. You really can't grasp how radical this movement was otherwise. The world of ancient Galilee was, frankly, brutal. Right at the top of the list, you had the heavy, very visible military presence of Roman soldiers. This was occupied territory, right? And the Romans imposed a crushing tax burden on the locals. That taxation forced countless everyday families into deep, unavoidable poverty. It was incredibly common to see hungry people right there in the streets, and without the safety nets of modern medicine, pervasive sickness was just a daily reality. You know, when you mix military occupation, severe hunger, and disease, people's survival instincts kick into overdrive, and that inevitably leads to severe interpersonal conflicts. This was a society under immense, relentless pressure, and it's exactly against this dark, heavy backdrop that a totally countercultural message emerged.
Which brings us to Section 2, the radical command: love. A countercultural message.
So, against that intense backdrop of societal struggle we just talked about, we find the first major teaching of this movement. In a society totally fractured by strict tribal lines and survival instincts, Jesus taught that the greatest commandment was love. Specifically, love your neighbor as yourself. And you have to understand, this wasn't just a polite suggestion. It demanded an unprecedented level of compassion in a deeply, deeply divided society. When you are literally struggling to feed your own family under Roman occupation, the idea of looking out for your neighbor as if they were your own flesh and blood, that was a massive, almost unthinkable paradigm shift.
Look, the biological default for survival is loving only your friends and your family. That was the expected social norm. You protect your own. But this movement introduced a radical new command: to extend that love to total strangers and, even crazier, to enemies. This went against literally every natural impulse in a world full of danger and oppression. To love an enemy meant breaking down the very walls that kept you safe.
So, what did this kind of love actually look like in practice? Well, it wasn't just philosophical. It directly combated the widespread poverty of the era. It looked like sharing your limited bread with hungry people. And remember, when food is scarce, sharing your bread isn't just a nice gesture, it is a genuine, high-stakes sacrifice. It looked like actual physical kindness shown to the sick and the poor. In an environment that screamed at you to hoard whatever you had just to survive, this movement actively taught people to open their hands and share.
Now, sharing bread is one thing, but this brings up a pretty profound question. How in the world do you love someone who has actively wronged you? How does this broad concept of love actually survive when you're faced with real interpersonal conflict?
That leads right into Section 3, Mercy over Revenge, breaking the cycle of conflict.
This is where the teachings shift from a general sense of compassion into a revolutionary, highly practical solution for the conflicts tearing the region apart. Forgive and you will be forgiven. This concept absolutely stunned people. The source material describes these incredible scenes set in massive, intricately carved temple courtyards where people were just floored by this level of compassion. Imagine being in a crowd, fully expecting someone to receive a harsh, traditional punishment, only to watch a crying woman completely overwhelmed with relief because she was shown absolute forgiveness instead of judgment. Mercy was suddenly presented as this incredibly powerful force, actually stronger than revenge. The ancient world operated heavily on an eye-for-an-eye mentality.
Seeking revenge was just the standard, accepted method of justice. But this teaching carved out a completely different path, choosing mercy and reconciliation instead. Think about the profound emotional weight of two men, previously locked in a bitter, maybe even generational conflict, tearfully reconciling. It actively broke the cycle of violence that was so pervasive back then.
Moving on to Section 4, Trusting Through the Storm, Finding Peace in a Terrifying World.
We've talked a lot about the social and interpersonal struggles, but we can't ignore the deep psychological and physical fears of the era. People were terrified of sickness, of hopelessness, and of unpredictable violent forces of nature. Just picture this scene. You have terrified disciples trapped in a tiny wooden fishing boat in the dead of night, getting absolutely battered by a violent storm. We're talking massive crashing waves and lightning, and right in the middle of that sheer chaos, Jesus peacefully raises a hand. Suddenly, there is complete calm on the water. The moonlight is just reflecting perfectly on this glass-like surface. Now, whether you view this historical narrative literally or metaphorically, it's an incredibly powerful illustration of confronting the chaotic storms of life.
The core message tied directly to that event was simple. Do not be afraid, only believe. This was the direct antidote to the immediate terror of the storm, sure, but it was also the antidote to the general, suffocating anxiety of that occupied, impoverished era we set up earlier. It was a radical call to stop living in fear.
It really boils down to the difference between living in constant fear, like a worried man praying all alone in the dark, totally overwhelmed by his circumstances, and trusting completely to find profound peace, like birds just flying freely over open fields. The teaching essentially said that true peace doesn't come from a lack of storms, but from exactly where you place your trust while you're in them.
Which brings us to our final point, Section 5, Greatness Through Humility, Flipping the Power Dynamic.
This principle directly confronts the strict social hierarchies of the time. Think about the overarching, heavily armed Roman authority of the first century. Against all of that came this wild statement: "The greatest among you shall be your servant." In a world dominated by emperors and military commanders who ruled exclusively through force and intimidation, this idea literally flipped the ancient world's entire concept of power upside down.
You have the traditional exercise of authority. Again, think of armed Roman soldiers asserting dominance in the streets. Contrast that with the ultimate example of this new teaching, the deeply intimate, humble act of a leader washing his disciples' feet in a warm, candlelit room. To really get how radical this is, you have to know that in the ancient Middle East, washing feet was a task reserved strictly for the absolute lowest-ranking servant in a household. So for a respected leader to get down on the floor and do it, that was an emotional, humbling inversion of everything they understood about status.
And this wasn't just some isolated ritual, right? It was a lifestyle. Putting humility into action meant actually helping the weak. It meant caring for the sick. It meant a leader sharing meals with ordinary people. Back then, who you shared a table with was everything. Sharing a meal crossed massive social and class boundaries. By actively walking among and eating with the poorest citizens, this movement completely democratized greatness. You didn't need wealth or a huge army to be great in this new kingdom. You simply had to be willing to serve others.
So, we've seen how radical these teachings of love, forgiveness, faith, and humility truly were against the harsh, unforgiving realities of ancient Galilee. They absolutely disrupted the social norms of poverty, military occupation, and vengeance. Which leaves us with a pretty fascinating thought to ponder as we wrap up. If these specific, countercultural teachings had the power to fundamentally transform a dusty, deeply conflicted region 2,000 years ago, how might those exact same principles of radical compassion and humble service shift the massive challenges we face in our world today? Something to think about. Thank you so much for walking through this explainer with me.